Welcome to this installment of Witness to Yesterday, the podcast of the Champlain Society. My name is J.D.M. Stewart. Last year, Canadians voted in a federal election, as well as 2 provincial and 2 territorial elections. Going to the polls is a regular feature of Canada's democracy. But our guests today argue that voting in elections is not enough. The public is capable of contributing much more, and history shows that it has. But governments could be engaging its citizens to a much higher level, and doing so would make for a healthier democracy. Our political leaders won't write the next act alone, but they will have to choose either to share the stage or risk losing the audience, write my guests today, Peter MacLeod and Richard Johnson. The 2 men have spent a lot of time thinking about our public and government. They are co-authors of Democracy's Second Act, Why Politics Needs the Public, published in 2026 by the University of Toronto Press. Peter MacLeod is the founder and principal of Toronto-based MASS LBP, and we will hear more about that in a moment. And he is a leader in public consultation and deliberative democracy. Peter is a frequent commentator about the experience of the citizen in its relationship with the state, and on the importance of public imagination and the future of responsible government. Richard Johnson is also with MASS LBP, where he is the policy director. He is also a former journalist whose byline has appeared in the Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, and The Walrus, among other publications. Richard's career also involved significant work in the nonprofit sector, as well as in international development. Peter, Richard, welcome to Witness to Yesterday.
It's great to be here.
Thanks so much, James.
So I thought I would start with getting an explanation about what MASS LBP is all about. So Richard, maybe you could give our listeners some insight into what that organization is and does.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. And I think it makes sense to start with the name itself, MASS LBP. There's a great quote from the American revolutionary essayist Thomas Paine, who wrote that there's a massive sense lying in a dormant state that good government should quietly harness. And I think that's an inspiring quote for us. It talks a lot about what we hope to do with people. The LBP simply stands for Led by People. And a lot of what we do can be summed up with the term citizens' assemblies and similar processes that involve randomly selected, demographically representative groups of people who are provided with a mandate, often from government, to learn together, to find common ground, to deliberate on important issues that might be stuck otherwise in politics as we know it, and to ultimately issue a series of recommendations that point towards better policy that serves the public good and maybe drives the conversation or our communities and societies forward in a way that regular politics can't do. So that's been about the last 20 years of MASS. There's been more than 50 of these assemblies. There's been thousands of Canadians that have served on them, and many more hopefully to come.
So given what MASS LBP does, it's obviously easy to see where the genesis of this book came from. And I want to ask Peter about something that's written in the introduction of the book. I think you visited a few constituency offices across the country. And then at the same time, while you were talking to Richard about this book, there was a mob riot on Capitol Hill in Washington. So take us back there and how this book came to be.
Well, in many ways, the book is simply our attempt to write down all the lessons that Canadians have been teaching us over the past 20 years, because Richard and I have been very fortunate. We get to work with Canadians in every corner of the country, and we get to work on political issues, but we get to work with them in such a way that it's not completely overrun by the kind of partisanship and polarization that characterizes so much of what people think politics is really all about. And, my path into this work began more than 20 years ago. I was doing some graduate work, and I decided that instead of going to Ottawa, I was actually in the UK at the time, or paying attention to the high drama in Westminster, I would get away from the center of politics. I would go to its periphery. And I decided to investigate one of the real, I think, consequential but unacknowledged democratic innovations that happened almost by accident in Canada. And that was how in the early 1970s, we created a network of constituency offices. And that seems like a strange thing to attribute as an innovation, because after all, most of these constituency offices, they are low spaces. They sit next to dry cleaners and pizza parlors and strip malls across the country. But they fundamentally changed how MPs understand their work. And given that everybody was critiquing politics 25 years ago about the excessive concentration of power at the center, I thought it'd be interesting to go out what I ultimately discovered as a root system. And let me tell you, the mostly middle-aged women who staff these offices are some of the hardest working, most dedicated Canadians you'll find. And almost to a person, I visited 100 of these offices. They would tell me that they have an even better job than their boss, a better job than the MP, because they actually get to help people every day. And I would have these great conversations about all the ways in which they took pride in their ability to figure out the passport office or to get a tax form dislodged. And then inevitably, I'd ask them what I thought was a innocuous question. I'd say, "When was the last time you had a town hall meeting?" And these very same community-minded women would kind of recoil, and their faces would darken. And it was a woman in Newfoundland with the kind of candor and straight talk that that province is famous for, who said to me, "Boy, why would I be having a town hall meeting? You only get out the mad, the bad, and the sad anyway." And it really struck me. And I probably didn't understand or appreciate the significance of the comment then. I probably laughed. But I thought it was very striking that these offices that actually weren't created for service provision were created for public engagement within the space of 40 years had totally lost that sense of purpose. And ostensibly in a mature democracy, we have a very conflicted relationship with this thing called the public. Having a town hall meeting seems as though it's beyond us. And it made me think about really what the public is, how we instantiate it. And obviously, when Richard and I started writing the book, by coincidence, we turned on the news, our inboxes started pinging, and there was the riot on January 6th, 2021. And, that's, I guess, a kind of public. That was a mob. And it was an expression of huge frustration, of a kind of democratic breakdown. And of course, it was impelled by a demagogic president. So it's an illustration of the potency of people. And our book and our belief is that the work of democratic institutions is actually to create spaces for democratic publics.
Let's talk about the public a little bit, because in your book, you talk about the public and publics with an S. And so maybe we could define our terms here. Who are we talking about when you talk about the public? Richard, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, when we talk about the public, we're certainly in many ways talking about that, mass of citizenry that probably Thomas Paine alluded to. When we think about the public, it is the people and places that we meet in our everyday lives. It's the public that engages with government, that engages with its community. It is the public in all senses that we think of it, and it is the public that, to Pete's point, is kind of feels like it has been neglected or dismissed by the very good government that should be relying upon it, and of course should be cultivating it in its work. And then, of course, in the book we talk about publics, as a singular and a plural. And I think this is important because a lot of the work that we do involves taking subsets or small representative samples of the public, for example, in a randomly selected citizens' assembly of 36 or 48 people who spend this little bit of time together, learning, deliberating, and, producing solutions, outcomes, recommendations that, represent the greater public good. And what we discovered, I think, as we thought about this book and moved beyond just the work that we do in citizens' assemblies, but looked around the world, looked at different kinds of opportunities, of types of engagements where we do see similar things. Where do we find people getting together, forming groups or being formed in small groups in which they're asked or have to overcome challenges or meet challenges? And this involves the work of learning, of understanding trade-offs, of deliberating, and figuring out solutions that affect a wider group of people. And whether you call them associations, whether they're called community organizations, whether they're formed on an ad hoc basis or a permanent basis, there are publics all around the world, all around the country that are informed or can become informed, that are engaged, and that are productive, that are capable of producing results. And so we realize that the publics that we work with when we form and facilitate citizens' assemblies are replicated are happening in so many different spheres. And that's what really excited us, to know that what we do involving small groups of people working together is actually happening in so many different kinds of spheres. And that really became kind of the catalyst, the driving force for Democracy's Second Act. It's more than just about citizens' assemblies or any particular model. It's about people working together, finding common ground, overcoming the sense that we might be polarized, that we might be different, that we might have nothing in common, or that there is no way forward and that traditional politics can't help us, and actually kind of showing that the opposite is true.
And so in the book, you two refer to the public as it can be seen as a risk or a resource. And Richard explained how it's a resource. How has it come to be seen as a risk by governments?
I mean, this is where I guess the subtitle of the book is significant. It seems like it's self-evident why politics needs the public, except increasingly, politics is operating without the public's involvement. Voter turnout continues to decline, trust and confidence measures in public institutions continue to decline. Political parties themselves have largely been hollowed out. We know that their membership numbers are thin. Local riding associations can barely conduct themselves and sustain themselves. And now, of course, the latest thing with the advent of AI, when you see the public opinion research industry kind of crying murder about this, is that we're taking even the public out of answering polling questions because we can create simulations of the public. We can create models of the public. And this is just bad, bad, bad. You know, like in a democracy, we have come to believe that the public is just another risk that we need to manage. And people have a good nose, they have a good sense of things, and they don't like being managed. They don't like being kept at a distance. So we need to take this thing, and it's really consequential in a democracy. We need to take the public, which is our greatest asset. Never before have we had a population that is as educated, as connected, as powerful. And we need to make them active participants in our democratic life. But that means creating platforms where people can come together, as Richard and I say, as problem-solving publics. Yes, they're social publics. Yes, they're cultural publics. But there also have to be productive problem-solving publics so that people feel that they're not just watching what happens to them in their community, but they actually have a chance to get involved in a way that allows them to solve some of the problems that confound them.
But are we saying that we have to force them? Because it seems like the public isn't actually that engaged. That's why they don't get involved in political parties anymore. They don't seem to be manifesting their interest in civic society. And maybe we're knocking on the door and nobody's home. So what do you think about that, Richard? Or Peter, whoever wants to take this one?
I'll just say quickly, and then maybe Richard can talk about the sort of three driving myths that we point to. But, you know, politics appears to be the only business where you get to blame the customer for not buying the product, right? Like people are choosing not to vote. They're choosing not to join the political parties. And we say the problem isn't the parties, it's the people. And I think we have that absolutely backwards. We need to be challenging political leadership to bring the public back into politics in a much more consequential way. But right now, they offer the public very little to do. And I think the public responds accordingly.
What would you add to that, Richard?
Yeah, well, I think this also gets into this notion of why it became apparent to Peter and I that there was this kind of so-called first act and second act of democracy, right? And I think a lot of what we're talking about in terms of the problems and what Peter just described as government not asking more of the public and the institutions of government, of democracy, not asking more of people. And when we think about the first act of democracy, to us, that means some of the great institutions and innovations that have been built over the last couple of hundred years that, of course, are very, very important. Free and fair elections, independent judiciaries, representative governments, periodic, obviously voting, a free press, and so many more things. And it is these institutions which we celebrate, but of course, that kind of feel a bit stuck and don't represent the capabilities of the public and the interest of the public that we see in our everyday work. So it feels like if a lot of what's happening and what you describe, decline of trust, voter apathy, disinterested or self-interested citizenry that can't devote the time, doesn't have the space, has too much else going on in its lives per se, and finds the political debate complex or intimidating in some way, I think those features represent the limits or the stuckness of that first act and its institutions. And I think when we talk about the second act, we talk about new forms of engagement that actually do tap into those capabilities of the people. Because, I mean, people get involved in so many ways, right? We volunteer in our communities. We want to become informed despite how hard it is to get, straight information about anything in politics these days. We want to be engaged in many facets. And of course, problems that government purports to solve are problems that affect all of us. So obviously, we want to be involved in ensuring that our lives are going to be better thanks to good democratic government. The first act is kind of stuck. It's stalled. It's not answering the call that people are a resource. It's basically treating us as a risk, which is why we kind of adapted this new way of looking at things, that we need some better practices, some better models, some better institutions, and some better ways of getting people involved. And that's what the second act is all about.
And you both make really good use of two great minds in American letters to look at the role of the public, John Dewey and Walter Lippmann. Can you tell us what each of these men represented in terms of what the public is capable of doing? And who wants to start with whom?
Well, maybe I'll just start by saying that John Dewey and Walter Lippmann were famous for having a debate that never actually physically occurred. But they were writing at the same time and in part in response to each other. Lippmann, having been one of the great journalists and opinion writers of the middle part of the 20th century, he felt that the world was just becoming too complicated, and that the idea that any one citizen could possibly have an informed view sufficient to have a more active role in the conduct of public affairs was becoming more and more incredible. And this concerned John Dewey because he is one of the great thinkers about education and about how we develop and grow. And consequently, Dewey had this idea of democracy, not just as this majoritarian winner-take-all game. He had the idea of democracy really as a platform for human and social development. He gave us this wonderful term that sits next to the idea of civic literacy, because we all know civic literacy. We should know more history. We should know how a bill becomes law. But what Dewey said is actually we need a sense of democratic fitness. And democratic fitness is about agency. It's about efficacy. It's about moral courage. And he imagined democracy as a place where we get a chance to practice those civic muscles that contribute to our democratic fitness. Lippmann, by the end, felt that, the idea of an omnicompetent citizen was impossible. What we replaced it with is the idea of an omnicompetent state. The idea that, well, if any individual, it's beyond them, we can trust good technocratic government, good public managers to make hard decisions for us. And I think, Dewey's response to this was, no, people can do more than we might assume, but we can do so much more together. And that we imagine there to be a quite competent public that can grapple with so many of these seemingly intractable issues. And we've come to believe democracy is a 51-49 game. We see good democratic governance that produces strong majorities of 70-30, 80-20. Maybe that's more the natural resting state when people have a chance to change their mind, take on more information, and also grow through the work of governing together.
Richard, would you add to that? Because it seems like Dewey is an idealist and Lippmann is maybe a bit more of a realist. What do you have to say about these two guys?
Oh, I think you're not the first person to kind of describe it in those terms. Absolutely, absolutely true. And I think, Walter Lippmann, one of the great journalists of the 20th century in America, and certainly a person to admire. But he did, to pick up on this notion that the political environment seemed complex and beyond the reach of average citizens to do more than simply vote and put their thumb on the scale in that way. And I mean, Lippmann even advocated that the best form of democracy is one in which citizens are, and this was his term, spectators, that we should be active watchers of democracy, but otherwise we shouldn't get involved because it's too complex. And Lippmann looked at all of these kind of proposals and ideas coming from great men like Dewey, who advocated for more public involvement through associations, through social learning and knowledge, through community building. And Lippmann thought And he even had the famous line. His book was called The Phantom Public. And he said, I hold that this public is a mere phantom. There is no sense of a public informing good policy. And instead, good government should be left to a class of managers, of elites, we might call them, technocrats, people who develop expertise in public administration, public management. And all we need citizens is occasionally to decide yay or nay, are they doing a good job? But how do these public administrators, how does government actually know what citizens want, what they need? Should we just trust a public opinion polling? Should we occasionally hold a rowdy town hall meeting, as Peter alluded to earlier? Or are there more ways to get involved? And again, you can kind of see how this boils down to a bit of a risk-resource argument, right? John Dewey truly believed that people were a resource for democracy, and furthermore, through this idea of democratic fitness, felt that it is the job of good government to cultivate that fitness, to help it develop, and to ensure, because democracy needs it to be sustained. And Lippmann felt, you know what, people are fundamentally a risk, they are apathetic, they are disinterested, they are busy with their lives, and we shouldn't ask more of them, because to do so would actually ruin democracy. And I'd ask anyone, who's experiencing the stuckness and the stalled out of democracy today to think about that. And do we really believe we belong on the sidelines as spectators, or involved, getting together in small ways and large to actually affect and change the trajectory of our societies?
A lot of this seems very, we spoke about the idealism of Dewey. And one of the things that struck me about your book is just how filled with idealism it was. And it was in some ways refreshing to read, because it's nice to see that there are people advocating for more public involvement. I was wondering, where could each of you talk a little bit about where your idealism comes from that's manifested in this book? Maybe we'll start with Peter and then hear from Richard on idealism.
Um, our idealism comes from Canadians. It comes from actually being in the room with this group that, frankly, many people never have the opportunity to meet, which is a diverse, representative group. It's not a stakeholder organization, it's community. And, when you have the opportunity to work with Canadians, you will have all of your assumptions about that public challenge. Time and again, I invite politicians into the room, senior public servants, and they have quite reasonably been conditioned by all of those dreadful town hall meetings to almost go in with their shoulders hunched, their jaws clenched, and worried that people are going to be there to play gotcha. And instead, what they find, a group that's half men, half women, balanced by age, coming from all of the different walks of life and socioeconomic backgrounds. And they meet people who are not interested in name calling, they're interested in problem solving, they're interested in learning. And the palpable sense of relief from the senior public servants and politicians is something to behold, because this is the public that we've all been looking for. So we are fundamentally optimistic about democracy's future. We think there's really important work that needs to be done to fight for the institutions that exist today. But we also think democracy doesn't end here. Our job is not just preservation. When we think back 100 years about how we used to do democracy in the 1920s, there are lots of ways in which the system has changed and evolved. And we can be both proud and a little bit embarrassed about how 100 years ago we did things. And 100 years from now, I hope we'll feel much the same about today. Proud as the inheritors of, one of humanity's great achievements, liberal democracy, but also embarrassed about all of the ways we failed to tap in to the capability of people to solve the problems that they find all around them.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true in terms of what has inspired our idealism. And, I understand idealism is one of those terms that can connote a couple of different things, right? Certainly it
I
can,
mean it in the
you
most
know,
positive way, Richard.
oh, no, of course. But I know to anyone out there listening and thinking about it, there's the sense that there's something, utopian or almost impossible about it, which of course is not true, but does speak to more of that sense of optimism and hope and just the belief in human the human spirit and capabilities. I mean, when Peter and I talk about like almost like the two different publics that we almost experience in our everyday lives, right? The public that we see in our work, which is caring and decent, compassionate when people get together, which is informed or desiring, becoming informed and knowledgeable about civic issues, which wants to be engaged, and of course is very capable of producing, effective outcomes. And then there's the public that we we all might perceive as out there, the public that is polarized or seems to be polarized because that's how the news presents it. That's how public information, public political polling might suggest it. That's what political parties certainly try to amp up. That's what our social media platforms certainly make billions off of, is the sense that outrage is important, and by elevating it, we have, well, I don't know what they stem to gain from it besides profit, but that public realm, the places where we have that dialogue, are skewed and warped. And there is no sense of where the public realm is anymore, where we actually can engage, except in these places like, we get to convene with citizens' assemblies. So the idealism comes from, in part, recognizing that this other outraged, apathetic, ignorant, polarized, misinformed public is an artifice. It's a very real problem, for sure, but it's not the real public. It's not the public we experience every day in our lives. When we go to the market, when we take our kids to school, we don't experience this kind of outrage. When we engage with people, it's not, dropping, gotcha comments and, slandering people for their beliefs or values. No, it's the everyday act is about finding common values, finding something that we actually, have in common or agree about, and moving towards that. So if we can see that there's this public that we truly perceive as there, that is the good and decent and capable and informed one, that's the one that provides the idealism. It's where can we find it? Where can we bring it together? Where can government bring it together? That's the great challenge.
It's almost like the social media world where many people are is a fake world, that it's not even truly reflective of what people want to do in your neighborhood. Because the examples you give of the way people actually act in the real world is putting a hand out, helping the neighbor, shoveling the sidewalk if they're unable. And yet we seem to have this perception that the social media world is democracy. And that's just not true, is it? Or am I conflating two things, or am I onto something?
You're absolutely onto something. I mean, first of all, we know that it's a subset of society that engages in social media. We know that the majority of the vitriolic and hurtful comments come from a very small subset of those social media users. And, we have given perhaps some of the most maladjusted people in society the biggest microphone. And then we say, hey, look, there's the public. And anybody exposed to that is going to be concerned. I mean, this is a challenge for Canada, though, because it is, of course, human nature to be careful or cautious or maybe even afraid of strangers. And even though we know from social psychology that we are much more cooperative as a species than we are competitive, that is actually our natural drive. We have to overcome that initial apprehension. We need ways that bring us into contact with each other in positive and pro-social ways. Social media isn't doing that for us. It's certainly not doing that for young people. Whatever the utopian promises of the internet as a force for democratization, they have been overtaken, of course, by business interests that are playing to our baser instincts. And in a country like Canada, that is as vast and as varied, we need intentional platforms, programs that connect us, that give us the chance to experience each other's parts of the country, to work together to achieve things that we can all agree are important. And at various points in our national story, of course, there have been opportunities to do just that at scale. And right now, I worry that we're at a bit of a low ebb for those kinds of programs and platforms that bring us together. But what we've seen time and again is when people have the chance to get involved, to do something meaningful that's real with others, Canadians will surprise you and they'll step forward. And we want politics that is involves a lot more of that.
And you write about the response to the Syrian refugee crisis as an example of Canadians rising to the occasion. I'm just going to stick with you, Peter, for a question, and then I've got one final one for Richard as our time continues to wind down here. One of the things that we're really interested in at the Champlain Society is Canada's history in documents. And I understand that there is a relationship between MASS LBP and the work you and Richard and others have been doing and Queen's University Archives. Can you tell us a bit about that?
It was one of the really quite heartening experiences of the last decade in this work because when you run citizens' assemblies, at the end of the day, it's like a little royal commission. And there's a lot of research and there's a lot of paper and there are a lot of drafts. And, we had thought that, frankly, if anything, we needed to save all of the receipts in case someone was to challenge us and say, well, those people didn't really reach consensus, or show us your steps. Now, nobody's ever actually challenged us in that way, but we had saved all of this scrap paper, all of these drafts, all of these final reports. And Queen's University indicated that they would be interested in creating an archive. And so now there is at Queen's records of several dozen of these citizens' assemblies that have taken place. And, it'll fall to future researchers to comb through all of those scraps and see what they can make of it. But I should say that Canadians, we don't typically know our own stories. And while globally Canada is recognized rightfully as the birthplace of modern citizens' assemblies that have been used by countries like Ireland to change their constitution 3 times in the last decade, where there have probably been somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 assemblies in countries around the world since it began 20 years ago in BC. This is one of Canada's most significant democratic exports. And I think embedded in it are a set of really important Canadian values about dialogue and problem solving and seeking common ground. And even if we don't see that reflected in our everyday political discourse, we know that's part of our Canadian value set. And so future researchers going to the Queen's Archives, I hope will be able to recreate some of the experiences that we've lived and be able to connect that to a larger global phenomenon so that we can, at some point, really map how democracy's second act came to be.
Richard, in order to find that common ground, I think it takes a lot of trust among the citizenry. And
Mhm.
your book has a lot to say about trust and the breakdown of trust. And I'm wondering, I think you guys write that the only thing worse than the people losing trust in democracy is government losing its trust in the people. How is trust the key to democracy's second act?
Well, I think that's a really good question. And I know that the last 10 or 15 years, especially over the course of this time, I think that Peter described there being a bit of a lull or an ebb in our great national conversations and our great debates and engagements with each other is also coincides with a loss of trust. And there's so much scholarship out there on people losing trust in government and losing trust in the media and losing trust in each other. I mean, more than we could possibly say here, and I'll say it to any listeners, you'll get through chapter 1 of the book and we write a lot more about it. But it did occur to us as we were thinking about the loss of trust that people reportedly have in government, in each other, in the very idea that we should live in a democracy, was the flip side of that. Is government still, or has it ever demonstrated great trust in people? If we think about how we build trust with each other as communities, as societies, as individuals, as neighbors, it's through those daily interactions. It's through those common problems or challenges we have to solve. It's acts that are little and big, on an everyday basis. And I think between each other, those acts need to, happen a lot more and do. But I think when it comes to government, I mean, how many of our interactions with government can be boiled down to more or less service encounters or simply going to the polls and voting? I mean, what do our democratic governments do to truly esteem us, to dignify us, to make it even feel like we are partners in this great project of democracy? I would argue very, very little of that is happening. And so that's why I think it's not a cop-out. I think in our book, we do ultimately put a lot of the onus on public administrators, on government itself, on the institutions of democracy that do feel stuck and like they're not grinding, that they have to think differently about people, think differently about how they engage with people. Again, opinion polling, a rowdy town hall meeting. Sometimes budgets only seem to allow for this, or thinking inside the box only seems to allow for this. But are we really thinking more broadly about that? And I go back to this notion of the role of good government, good democratic government, especially in Canada, is to not just provide good services and, manage a good budget, but to cultivate that democratic fitness that we talk about and that John Dewey talked about. And that's simply not happening. I think you could look at any institution and say that's not really there. And if our government is not going to esteem us and dignify us and show respect to citizens as true partners in this great journey together, how are we supposed to trust them? So I throw it back to them. We do in the book quite a lot. And I'm, certainly curious for listeners and readers to decide for themselves if we've got this right.
Well, I was, as you're talking about that, I'm wondering if a member of parliament might push back against you and say, I have town hall meetings, I have a New Year's levy, I have an open office. Would an MP not push back and say, I think you guys have it wrong. I'm actually trying to engage with my constituents. I answer all their emails. Maybe.
Well, if they are doing all of those things, good on them. Totally right. And we can do more. The question of trust is fundamentally a question of capability. When I trust someone, it's probably because I know that they'll deliver. Right? And I've seen them. People see government fail to deliver. And equally, government looks at people and feels like they're not particularly capable either. That's why it says, actually, our consultation window is going to be really small. We're only going to ask 3 questions. The decisions have actually already been made, right? It's not like they're going to people in a really open-minded way. And I'll give you one example, maybe to conclude on, because I think we have had great moments like Canada's response to the Syrian refugee crisis that should give us great confidence in ourselves to do big and consequential things with Canadians. But I'll tell you what, one of the decisions that was made in the last few years in this country, to Richard's point about dignity, just really grinds my gears. One of the things that Canada has done so well has been traditionally around its immigration programs, its point system. Let's put aside the fact that that consensus and that system has been largely broken with a huge social consequence. But it was something smaller than that. It was the citizenship ceremonies, which our governments have led and funded for several generations now. And our former Governor General, Adrian Clarkson, and John Ralston Saul created a whole organization to enhance the citizenship ceremony to make it even more poignant and dignified.
We hosted one at my school some years ago, a citizenship ceremony.
There you go. And there's rarely a dry eye in the house. New Canadians, old Canadians, everybody who attends one says, this is good.
Yes.
And what did the federal government do? It has defunded citizenship, in-person citizenship ceremonies and pushed them over to Zoom. And I think this is absolute travesty. I mean, what a way to affirm people's connection to the country and to one another. Democracies need civic rituals. These rituals affirm our values and our responsibilities to one another. And it shouldn't just be that those rituals exist, of course, for newcomers. They need to touch us in various ways throughout our lives as citizens. And governments can do this. Canadians can do this for themselves when given the opportunity as well.
Yeah, we can never forget the importance of symbolism in rituals in any kind of entity. I just want to squeeze in, I know we've been going for about 40 minutes, but there's an issue close to my heart, and Richard, maybe you could talk about it, and it's young people and democracy and the issue of whether they are informed enough. And I'm just curious as to your opinion of where do young people fit into our democracy?
At the center, I would say briefly. And I don't just mean that as a platitude, like they have the longest future ahead of them. I'm reminded of one of the early conversations Pete and I had together about this book, was just thinking about like, what are the sense-making institutions? What are the places where we become truly informed? And obviously, when we talk about the world of media right now, journalism, which of course plays a very important role of that, it's fractured. It's obviously going through a lot of revolution in terms of how it's funded, what it means to people. CBC has, of course, been politicized, public media, and so on. But that's one question of all of this. You ask about, young people and getting involved, to this question of like, what are we doing to involve people? Peter and I both agree that this arbitrary restrictive voting age at 18 or 19 years old, depending or where you are, feels exclusive, that we're not doing enough to cultivate citizenship at even an earlier stage. And it's our personal belief that we should lower the voting age to include more young people in that and get them more involved. When we run citizens' assemblies, often we advocate for people at least as young as 16 being able to participate if they so choose. And of course, young people are learning and getting their information and knowledge in so many different ways, are much more likely to be online and on social media platforms. Peer-to-peer learning is less about getting together at the mall or at the park or wherever, and often is more online and on TikTok and other places like that. So that sense of wanting to learn and wanting to be engaged and wanting to learn from each other is still there. It's just that we're struggling with how to make these platforms and these places a true public realm and a true public space where we can actually engage together. I'm not terribly worried about young people becoming misinformed any more than I am about any other parts of the electorate and the citizenry, right?
Right.
But there is, this sense that democracy is only for a small subset of people when we talk about the work that needs to be done. It's not for everyone. I think we're being really exclusive when it comes to tapping the capabilities, not just of all people, but especially of young people as well. And I think Democracy's Second Act needs to be as much about this generation and the young generation as it is about everyone else.
Yeah, well, I think the book will get readers thinking about the expansive nature of democracy, the spaces that are out there that are still to be filled, and the role that citizens can get out there and extend their arms into more of what is available if they want to be engaged. And I think it's a really important book. So Peter and Richard, thank you very much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you very much.
It's our pleasure.
My guests today have been Peter MacLeod and Richard Johnson, authors of Democracy's Second Act, Why Politics Needs the Public, published in 2026 by the University of Toronto Press. You've been listening to Witness to Yesterday, the podcast of the Champlain Society. If you like what you heard today, please forward the link for today's program to your friends and others who might be interested to hear it. Consider hitting the like button as well on whatever platform you heard us today. The goal of the Witness to Yesterday podcast is to bring attention to the wonderful works of history that are published in this country on a regular basis. To find out more about the Champlain Society, please visit our website at champlainsociety.ca. To reach me or any of our hosts on Witness to Yesterday, drop us a line at info@champlainsociety.ca. We would love to hear from you. This podcast is made possible by the members of the Champlain Society who work hard to bring to life original documents in Canadian history. We also want to thank a consortium of Canadian scholarly publishers for their financial support. That includes the University of Toronto Press, UBC Press, and McGill Queen's University Press. We are also grateful for the support of the UTP Journal team. My name is J.D.M. Stewart. Today's episode was recorded on April 9th, 2026, and I'd be remiss if I weren't to say it's the 109th anniversary of the Battle of Vimy Ridge, and it was produced by Kevin Ball.